Everybody knows who won the Second World War. But the question I want to ask is, who won the peace? We're celebrating 70 years of unprecedented peace in Europe this year, 2015, in Europe. And we tend to take that for granted because peace seems to be the norm. War has become unthinkable. But when I was at school, it was anything but unthinkable. My father's generation went to war. My grandfather's generation went to war. And even at high school, I was part of military exercises at school every week. I even went to a military camp in my school holidays. But today's generation takes peace for granted. And unless we are conscious of the values and the story that gave us that peace, we run the risk of losing it. Peace and freedom are fragile concepts. So let's look at the story. When the Canadian troops came through Holland, where I live, exactly 70 years ago, and liberated the towns north of Arnhem and heading towards the entrance to Germany, down through the Ruhr Valley area, liberated the Dutch from Nazi occupation after 5 years. The soldiers gave out chocolate and kissed the girls, and in people's popular imagination, they went home and everybody started living peacefully ever after. That was far from the case. Europe, after the Second World War, was anything but peaceful. War had ceased, but peace had not yet returned. Europe was shattered. Europe was traumatized. Europeans were fearful. They were bitter. They were wounded psychologically as well as physically. Families were broken. Cities were devastated. How could Europe be rebuilt? What was the story of the rebuilding of Europe, and how did that happen? There's a famous statue in the city of Rotterdam by the sculptor Zadkine. It shows this grotesque figure of a human being without a heart. It represented the city of Rotterdam that was bombed in the center on the 10th of May 1940 by Hitler's Blitzkrieg. And it represents, in some ways, the whole of Europe after the Second World War, suffering from a severe case of post-trauma stress disorder. It was into this situation where a group of men began thinking about what kind of foundations can we build on to rebuild Europe. You see, this was a tense time as the Cold War was getting started. You may have heard of the Berlin airlift. After the Soviets blockaded Berlin and prevented any supplies getting into the Allied quarters of Berlin. And they had to initiate an airlift from Frankfurt Airport with planes taking off every few minutes to bring in all the supplies necessary to keep people alive in Berlin. This was the time where the Kremlin had a stronghold on the trade unions in Germany, Western Germany, in Italy, in France, as they tried to cripple the new democracies that were starting in those nations. It was a time of a lot of fear. I want to tell you about the story of a man named Robert Schuman. Perhaps you recognize that name belonging to a famous German composer. This is not who we're talking about. This man spells his name with one N, Robert Schuman. He was the French foreign minister after the Second World War. But he wasn't born in France. He was born in Luxembourg. His father was a Frenchman who'd left France after the Germans invaded the part of France where he lived, Alsace and Lorraine. And he decided he didn't want to live under Bismarck. He wanted freedom. So he went across the border into Luxembourg, married a girl from Luxembourg, and they had Robert. Robert grew up studying, actually, in German schools because he went to Metz, which is now in France, but then was under German control. He went to German universities. He actually had to change his nationality 5 times during his life because of the ebb and flow of war. And he became a member of the French Parliament after the First World War, when all that territory returned to France. In fact, as a lawyer, he was given the task of harmonizing the laws of Alsace and Lorraine with French law. And actually, he did it a little bit differently than the rest of France. He wanted to keep certain freedoms for faith-based schools and other initiatives in that part of France. And until this day, the laws in the Alsace and the Lorraine areas are different from the rest of France. This is called Lex Schuman. When the Nazis invaded France in 1940, Robert Schuman was resisting their attempt to justify what they were doing, and as a result, he was the first member of parliament arrested by the Nazis and taken and put into solitary captivity for 7 months. But Robert Schuman was a devout man of prayer. He was a Catholic believer. He knew what to do in solitary confinement. He had often spent times in prayer retreats. It wasn't totally strange to him at all, and he dug deep into his spiritual roots and asked God for the sustenance for these difficult times. The Germans failed to break him. The Germans failed to compromise him. And he refused to offer them an article on any subject, whatever, just so that the Germans could use his good name. So they changed their tactics. They began to try to give him more freedom, put him under house arrest, and woo him in a different way. This gave him the opportunity to go to the libraries. By this time, he was transferred to Neustadt in Germany. And as he studied the news coming in there, he gleaned enough information to come to the conclusion that there was no way that Germany could sustain this war, that the war effort would have to peter out. The Germans were boasting to him also about what they were doing with the Jews at the time, information that wasn't generally known in the West. So he decided it was time for him to escape. And so, dressed as a nun, he managed to slip away and cross the border back into occupied France and actually travel 700 kilometers to the free part of France in the south. There was a great price put on his head at the time, and the Germans were very keen to try to lay their hands on him. But he found his way into the south, where the puppet regime of Marshal Pétain, the Vichy regime, had control. He went to Marshal Vichy, who had actually asked Schuman to join his cabinet before, but Schuman wanted nothing of this compromise puppet cabinet. And he told him about what he had learned from his time in Germany, but Pétain was not interested in this information, so he passed that information on to Western embassies there and made sure the information went out to the West. A few months after his arrival there, the Germans took over the whole of France, and so again he had to go underground. And that's where he began to study and ask himself, on what kind of basis can we rebuild Europe after this war that inevitably must come to an end? So Robert Schuman, while in hiding, after going underground, after the Nazis invaded the south again, or took over the south of France, began to think, how can we rebuild Europe? On what foundations? How can we break the cycle of vengeance and violence that had gone on century after century? He said a new order was needed, an order that was unprecedented in history. The old order had been there based on nation states since 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia that had brought the 30 Years' War to an end, the so-called religious wars that followed the Reformation between Catholics and Protestants. And this is where the nation state began to emerge as the new building block of Europe. Prior to that, it had been primarily empires, because it was decided at that treaty that whatever religion the king or the prince would have, that would be the religion of all the people. If it was Lutheran, everybody would be Lutheran. If it was Catholic, all would be Catholic. If it was Calvinist, everybody would be Calvinist. Now, those were the three options. There were smaller groups that were not included in this agreement. But this new order of nation states belonging to certain religions or certain denominations became the framework on which Europe began to emerge into the 18th century. And it led to a system of alliances, of nations grouping together in some kind of balance of power. But despite all the efforts to keep a balance, at times things became unbalanced, and this system had eventually led to 2 world wars. The First World War was a war between the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. Nationalism had failed, Schuman thought. It was too weak in France. It was too strong in Germany. Robert Schuman began to draw deep into his understanding of Catholic social teaching that he had studied earlier to find a way forward. You see, back in the 19th century, one of the popes had sent out an encyclical, that is a papal letter, a pastoral letter, called Rerum Novarum, about new things. And this is a very historic document that helped the Catholic Church come to grips with the modern industrialized world. And Schuman was quite a student of this teaching. And it began to give him a framework based on biblical values for thinking what kind of society could they build towards in Europe. And he began to articulate in his own mind an application of Christian teaching to the realm of international politics. He understood that the root of all democracy came from Christ's teachings, or the roots of true democracy. That is, the principle of equality, the practice of brotherly love, individual freedom, respect for the rights of the individuals. Now, some may say, well, those are not specifically Christian things. Well, actually, if we're going to talk about equality, we really have to recognize that there's only one basis for talking about equality of human beings, and that is the Christian doctrine that we are created in the image of God. The doctrine of evolution does not give us a base for equality. That gives us a base only for the survival of the fittest. And he believed that the true roots, really, of democracy came from this Christian teaching. Practice of brotherly love. We love to talk about brotherhood, but sometimes we divorce that from fatherhood. Is that ever possible, to have brothers without a common father? He even said democracy will either be Christian or it will not be. An anti-Christian democracy will be a parody which will sink into tyranny or into anarchy. What lay behind all of this was his understanding of human beings created in the image of God, and therefore with human dignity and infinite value. And that was true for Frenchmen. That was also true for the Germans. And even while he was there underground, because of the German presence, he tried to persuade his fellow Frenchmen that after the war, the French would have to learn how to forgive and love the Germans in order to rebuild Europe. Many of his fellow Frenchmen thought that was just treason, that was crazy. This is how radical his Christian thinking was. He said, loving your neighbor as yourself, the teachings of Jesus, was a democratic principle which applied to the nations meant being prepared to serve and love neighboring peoples. So what did that mean in international politics regarding the French and the Germans who had been habitual enemies? He said, if Christianity taught that we were children of the same God, regardless of race, color, social status, or profession, states too should be treated as equals. The universal law of love and charity made every man our neighbor, he wrote. And social relations in the Christian world had been based on this ever since. No race or nation could claim a greater importance in God's eyes. And so he was laying foundational principles on which his plan eventually would emerge. So applied to the community of peoples, forgiveness and reconciliation, even with those presently seen as the enemy, were Christian imperatives. He understood that the European story was deeply rooted in the Christian story. And when cut off from those roots, Europe would lose the foundations for equality for human dignity, for true tolerance and compassion. Europe, he came to see, had become a community of peoples, had to become a community of peoples deeply rooted in basic Christian values of freedom, solidarity, equality, and peace. In the spring of 1948, actually during a 7-month period when he served as the Prime Minister of France, in a phase when there were lots of turnovers of government, he found himself on a train engaged in a conversation with a businessman who had just returned from a conference in Switzerland. He was very enthusiastic by the transformation that had happened in industrial relations, particularly coming from the north of France in Lille. Employers and employees from coal mining areas there had gone to this conference in Switzerland and had heard a message of forgiveness and reconciliation. And it had resolved a very tense situation where there had been strikes and tension between the employers and the employees. And these trade unionists came back with a new spirit of reconciliation and cooperation to labor government clashes there in the north of France. Schuman was very interested in this story. He wanted to know more about the organization that was behind it. An organization that went by the name of moral rearmament, that had been initiated by a Lutheran evangelist named Frank Buchmann before the Second World War started. As the nations were rearming, his message was what the world needs is moral rearmament. He wanted to meet this man, Frank Buchmann, and it was arranged for him to have a dinner with him in a private home in France. And he heard about this place way up in the hills, or the mountains, I should say, above Montreux on the eastern end of Lake Geneva, a place called Caux, C-A-U-X, a beautiful turreted castle-like hotel, a Disneyland-like hotel, if you like, that looked right out over the lake in one of the most magnificent views, perhaps, even in the world. And how that this place had been set up after the war by volunteers from the moral rearmament movement as a place for people from all different nations to come together and find forgiveness, find reconciliation, and touch heart to heart. Thousands actually came from Germany, of industrialists, of politicians, of media people, church leaders, educationists, and they met their counterparts from many other nations, and they heard their messages about forgiveness, about reconciliation, and about the way forward based on Christian principles for Europe. And Schuman said, well, I don't know who to trust in this new Germany. Who can you advise that I come in contact with? Frank Buchmann told him over this meal, we have many good men in Caux, and I will introduce you to some. And so it was that Robert Schuman was introduced to Konrad Adenauer, who became the first chancellor of Western Germany after the war. Like Schuman, Adenauer was also a devout believer, a Catholic. He also believed that Europe had to be rebuilt on Christian foundations, and he, with members of his family, came to many conferences in Caux. And it was this trust relationship that these two men built together that gave the opportunity for a radical plan to be developed and announced to the world. In fact, later, Konrad Adenauer said to Schuman, I consider it to be providential. That means that God's hand is behind this, that the weight of this task of rebuilding Europe rests on the shoulders of men like you and myself. And he also mentioned a third man, Alcide de Gasperi, the Italian Prime Minister, who also was a devout believer. That is, men who are filled with the desire to build the new edifice of Europe on Christian foundations. Now, these men were the ones responsible for signing the Treaty for a European Coal and Steel Community in 1951. And on their way to Paris to sign this treaty for the institution that was going to be the forerunner of what we know of today as the European Union, the three men took took time out to go on a prayer retreat in the Marialach monastery close to Koblenz to present this whole project to God. Such was their understanding that they were doing something significant in the work of God's kingdom. It was on the 9th of May in 1950 when Robert Schuman surprised the nations with a short 3-minute presentation of a plan that would unite the coal and steel industries from nations who had been enemies and put them under a higher authority, an independent authority, so that neither government could use those industries to build a war machine. This was the first step towards making war unthinkable, and the first step towards seeing a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values emerge. Robert Schuman's prime minister at that time was not fully aware of this plan. It took everybody by surprise. It was a very bold move to accept a former enemy, the defeated party of the Second World War, as an equal party to the French, to the victors. De Gaulle, who later became president, thought this was ridiculous. Never in history had the conquered party been treated on equal terms, and that was in stark contrast with the Treaty of Versailles, which was out to get vengeance on behalf of the British and the French against the Germans. But here was a very different spirit, an opposite spirit, a spirit of forgiveness, a spirit of reconciliation. And it was this step that came out of Robert Schuman's faith that made the first step towards what we know of as today, the European Union, make that possible. The press actually called this the Schuman bomb. And so the first step was taken through a whole series of different institutions that we know of today as the European Union. I was telling this story to a group of people in the European Parliament not so long ago. And while I was telling this same story, next to me was a member of the European Parliament from Finland, Sari Essayah. And she was receiving tweets in on her phone, and she was responding to that while I was talking. And as soon as I finished, she asked to say something. She said, what Jeff has just been telling us about is the background to the announcement that just has been made that Europe, the European Union, is going to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And so it was then that Herman van Rompuy, the President of the European Council, and José Manuel Barroso, the President of the European Commission at the time, and Martin Schulz, the President of the European Parliament, together traveled to Oslo to receive the recognition that these 70 years of peace that we've enjoyed in Europe since the Second World War were based on the work of the founders of the European Union, rooted in basic Christian values. Thank you very much.